All right, welcome back, everybody. In the last set of notes, I hinted at what we were that we were going to be talking about cancer. Remember that the cell is controlled by a series of on and off switches, sort of. And when there's a mutation, sometimes a cell can divide when it's not supposed to. And I said that can lead to cancer. So let's go ahead and talk about cancer. This is what makes cell division interesting. I don't think cell division is interesting otherwise. It's that cancer is interesting. So, what is cancer? Well, interestingly, cancer is more than 200 different diseases. So, the question is, why are they all called cancer? Well, they have certain things in common. It's identified by the presence of malignant tumors, which I'll explain what a malignant tumor is, that invade surrounding tissues and then spread to other parts of the body. And that's sort of the definition of cancer, although there are some blood cancers that don't have tumors specifically, but most of them, it's uncontrolled mitosis. And that's what defines the cancer itself. So, what does cancer have to do with mitosis? Well, I kind of just said it. So, cancer is uncontrolled mitosis, and now there's too many cells, and those cells are not functioning correctly, and they produce tumors. So, if you take a look at the two images on here, this one is a brain scan. It's a normal brain scan, and then here there's a brain tumor, and you can see it kind of invading into the surrounding brain tissue. And then the image down below, it is linked to a video, and the video is actually linked on our Canvas assignment for this. So if you're interested in watching it, it's a fascinating video about a woman who had this huge tumor, and it's benign. I'll tell you what that means. And she was told not to have it removed, and then finally she went and talked to some other doctors who said, no, we're going to remove this, and they remove it for her. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's go back to what tumors are. So there are these extra cells that are going through mitosis too fast. It's uncontrolled. Benign tumors, the word benign means harmless, and that does not mean that tumors are harmless. So if you have a benign tumor growing in your brain, it is absolutely not benign. What it means is that it's not going to spread to other parts of the body. So a benign brain tumor isn't going to spread to our thyroid or our breast or a liver or something like that. It's not going to spread. But that is what malignant tumors do. So some of you might recognize the Spanish word mal, which means bad. So malignant tumors are cancer, and what makes them special is that they can metastasize. Metastasize means spread to other parts of the body. So, for example, I had a friend in college who had skin cancer, and they thought they removed it all, and they did not. And it, unbeknownst to her, metastasized to some of her internal organs. So that was a malignant tumor, and then it spread to other parts of her body. And sadly, she passed away from skin cancer. We often think that skin cancer is not deadly. If you catch it, it doesn't have to be. But she did pass away from hers. And I will just say about the lady in the video here, her tumor starts out benign, but then because she waited so long, it does become malignant. So they'll discuss that a little bit in the video. It's a very sad turn of events. All right, so why do some people come down with cancer and other people don't? So there's three main reasons that people come down with cancer. So number one, some people come in contact with cancer-causing agents, which are called carcinogens, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information about that. Some people inherit cancer-causing genes. So cancer sometimes runs in people's families. You might know that your grandma and a couple of your aunties and your mom had breast cancer. Then that means that they probably have a cancer gene that's getting passed through the family. But the majority of us get cancer because of unlucky mistakes when our DNA is being replicated. So do you remember I said during interphase, the DNA has to be copied, otherwise we'd start running out of DNA every time the cell divided. So the cell has to copy the two sides of the chromosome, and when it's copying that second side, sometimes, always, it makes a few mistakes, and a few mistakes are normally okay, but some mistakes can affect those stop signs, the cell control points that determine whether our cells are going to divide or not. And they can affect other important genes, and that can lead to cancer for us. So let's just practice really quickly what carcinogens are. You probably are vaguely familiar with the idea that there are some things in our environment that cause cancer. So it's anything that increases the risk of cancer, usually by causing mutations in the DNA. So examples, chemicals in cigarettes. When people are smoking cigarettes, they're full of carcinogens. Radiation, it could be nuclear radiation, much worse than ultraviolet radiation, which comes from the sun, but they both can cause DNA damage and can cause cancer. The other one that I always like to point out here, it's just one that students aren't really familiar with, you haven't heard of before maybe, and it's important. Some viruses, it's pretty rare, but there are some viruses that are carcinogenic. They can cause cancer. And a really important one that I want students to always know about is called human papillomavirus, HPV. Now, that's not the same as HIV, which causes AIDS. They both happen to be sexually transmitted viruses, but it's not the same one. So it's a sexually transmitted disease, and unfortunately, most people who have HPV don't even know they have it. Lots and lots of people with HPV are asymptomatic. They don't have any symptoms. Unfortunately, HPV can cause cervical cancer in infected women. And what I found is that most of my students have no idea what a cervix is. Some of you may have been lucky enough to see a baby be born, but I just thought I'd include this image. So here's the baby, and it is pressing on the cervix. The cervix is a muscle that keeps the baby in place, and it stays closed so that the baby doesn't fall out. When it's time for the woman to give birth, the cervix opens up so that muscle widens about 10 centimeters so that the baby's head can push through and then the baby can be born. That's where the cancer happens. And unfortunately, women don't have any pain receptors in the cervix, so they don't notice if they're developing a tumor. They can't see it and they don't feel it. So the only way to check for that cancer is an exam with a doctor, and they usually recommend that you get them every couple of years, especially if you're sexually active. And they basically go up there and test a few of the cells to make sure that they're not cancer. Nowadays, there is this vaccine. I can't even tell you how good vaccines are. It drives me nuts that we've had problems with vaccines in the COVID era here. The Gardasil vaccine is a vaccine that protects us from human papillomavirus, and in particular protects women from cervical cancer. And so that's just a huge one. Lots of you have probably had your Gardasil vaccine already. We usually give it to girls around age 12, I think, is roughly when they give the vaccine, somewhere in that area, hopefully before women have become sexually active. All right, let's talk about what makes cancer cells unique. We already know that they go through uncontrolled mitosis. It turns out they're virtually immortal. Cancer cells can divide and divide and divide. Most cells in your body only divide about 40 times and then they stop dividing. They just get old and they stop dividing. But cancer cells have had these weird mutations that allow them to keep dividing even though they have other things wrong with them, and they can keep going and going. If you're interested, there's a very, very fascinating story about Henrietta Lacks, and maybe some of you have heard of Henrietta Lacks. It's a story. Well, I'm not going to go into the details because I don't want this video to take too long, but it's linked here. And if you'd like to learn more about Henrietta Lacks, if you haven't heard about her, really fascinating story. Bad. Good came from it, I guess, but it was a bad story. Something bad happened in it. Okay. Cancer cells also lack contact inhibition. What that means is that normal cells, when they divide and then they touch, they're supposed to stop dividing. So imagine my elbow. I skinned my elbow and I have a big cut, and now the cells are dividing to close up that wound. Once they close up the wound and they start touching each other, they're like, okay, time to stop dividing. But cancer cells don't do that. So they divide and divide and divide and divide and divide, and they pile on top of each other, and that forms a tumor. Cancer cells have the ability to break away. That's called metastasizing, and that doesn't happen in any other time in your life. So if I have liver cancer, it's possible for the liver cell to break away and go to my brain and start developing a liver tumor on my brain. That never happens any other time in your life unless you have cancer. They look different. So cancer cells also have structural changes. So this is a cancer cell in the middle with all these weird like hair-like projections coming out. Those little puff balls, those are white blood cells that are attacking the cancer cell. So your immune system is supposed to be able to eat cancer cells. And when we get cancer, it's actually a flaw in our immune system. Something's wrong in our immune system. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but how we're trying to wake up the immune system to just gobble up our cancers. That's something that's coming in the future. And then importantly, and I mentioned this earlier, cancer cells lose their normal function. So if you have, sometimes students ask me this, leukemia is a blood cancer where we get lots and lots of extra white blood cells. So shouldn't that person be super immune if they have all these extra white blood cells? And the answer is not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The immune cells, these white blood cells that are forming, don't function correctly. And so the person is giving a lot of energy to grow these cells, and the cells are not helping them fight disease in any way. All right, so I mentioned this earlier. Cancer genes can be inherited. Everybody has genes that have some fancy names. They're called proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes. These are good, normal, healthy genes. They're the stop signals in the cell cycle that control cell division. A mutation in one of these genes may cause it to become what we now call an oncogene. Onco means cancer. An oncologist is a cancer doctor. The good news, I keep going back and forth, good and bad, it appears to take much more than one mutation to make a normal cell become a cancer cell. We have so many backup genes that protect us that it takes like 6 to 8 mutations before a cell becomes cancerous. So that's the good news. If we inherit a bad gene, we might have other genes that will protect us. It also explains why people are more likely to develop cancer when they're older. That's because their DNA has been copied and copied and copied as their cells are dividing. And the more copies, the more mistakes that get made on the copied DNA. And so that starts adding up, it starts accruing. And so people are more and more likely to develop cancer as they get older. So here's the whole section about Henrietta Lacks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about her, but she was a lady in 1951 who was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Cells were taken from her body without her knowledge and without her knowledge of her family. These were cancer cells. And then the doctor started growing these cancer cells in his laboratory. And then he was like, oh my gosh, these cells keep dividing because they're cancer cells. And he wrote a scientific paper. And then scientists all over the world started contacting him and saying, hey, can we have some of those cells? We'd like to study those cells. And so he started putting these cells in the mail and mailing them to laboratories all over the world. So these cells have been used for all kinds of good things, but the problem was that it was not used with Henrietta Lacks's permission or the permission of her family. There are now very, very strict rules about what tissues and cells are allowed to be used, and patients must give permission for any of this to happen. So, and there's an entire thick book written about what happened to Henrietta Lacks and her family, and I'm not doing it justice at all, but just be aware of that. So from the cells, the good part of this story is that from her cells being used all over the world, we've gotten the polio vaccine. Some of her cells were sent into outer space to study how we would survive in space. They've been used for cloning and mapping genes. They've been used for in vitro fertilization, which is how people need to get pregnant if they can't get pregnant otherwise. So many things, so much good has come from her cells, even though they were taken without her knowledge or her family's knowledge. And so that hopefully has been fixed in terms of never being allowed to happen again. All right, so it says the usage of the cells for medical research and commercial purposes continues to raise concerns about privacy and patients' rights. Here's the weird thing. There's no way of knowing exactly how many of Henrietta's cells are alive today. One scientist estimates that if you could pile all of the HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks, HeLa, cells ever grown onto a scale, they'd weigh more than 50 million metric tons. That's how many laboratories all around the world are using these cells. So it's an inconceivable number given that an individual cell weighs almost nothing. Another scientist calculated that if you could lay all the HeLa cells ever grown end to end, they'd wrap around the Earth at least 3 times, spanning more than 350 million feet. In her prime, Henrietta herself only stood a bit over 5 feet tall. little lady, and lots of cells of her cells have been grown now. All right, let's talk about what a biopsy is. So, once we think we might have cancer, we find a tumor, for example. A biopsy is a test to check if the cells in a tumor are cancer or not. So, the cells are removed from the suspect area and looked at under a microscope. So, they might go through the mouth, that's called an endoscopy. They might, if it's on the skin, they might punch a little hole in the skin and pull the cells out, or they might do a needle biopsy. In this case, it's on the thyroid. They're using an ultrasound to take a look, and then they stick the needle in and they can see where the needle is. So they make sure they put the needle in the right location. If the cells are cancerous, the biopsy can help to determine how aggressive the cancer is. So cancers are rated on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being the least aggressive and 4 being the most aggressive. And then the biopsy also helps them guide what treatment options. So there are 3 main treatments, and then now we're coming up with some new treatments. So chemotherapy is the treatment most people are familiar with. It interferes with the process of cell division. These are rapidly dividing cells, so chemotherapy stops cell division. Unfortunately, this affects any other cells that are fast dividing, and that would include hair cells. That's why we lose our hair when we go through chemotherapy, is because our cells are dividing fast there, and blood cells. And so people often become anemic when they're going through chemotherapy because it's attacking cells that divide quickly. Obviously, we can have surgery. So surgeons may try to remove a tumor, but if they leave any of the fast dividing cancer cells left behind, then the cancer may return. So if a few of the cells are still dividing and they got left behind, then they can cause that tumor to come back. So the surgeons often have to remove a very large area to make sure that all of the cancer cells have been removed. We can also use radiation, and this is a weird idea. Radiation causes cancer because it damages DNA. Well, scientists figured out, well, why don't we damage the DNA of these cancer cells so much that even the cancer cells can't divide anymore? So it says damages the DNA of the tumor cells, but may also damage the DNA of healthy cells, leading to future cancers. So none of these treatment options are ideal. There's risks with all of them. So what we are working on that is absolutely fascinating is that scientists are going to, they are currently, like this is something that's going on and we're getting better at it. They look at somebody's DNA and they look at what mutations they have, and then they tailor make the special like medicines you can swallow based on which mutations you have. And the ideal is to wake up the immune system so that the immune system would just attack the cancer cell and you would never lose your hair or have to go through surgery or experience radiation. None of that. That the immune system would just gobble up our cancer cells. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Let me know if you have any questions.